heat in Tucson was relentless that July afternoon in 2001. Waves of desert air shimmered above the asphalt, distorting everything in sight. At a small roadside cafe on the outskirts of town, 26-year-old Clara Jennings stepped out into the blinding sunlight after her shift. She had been a waitress there for 3 years, always polite, always smiling, always on time. The regulars adored her, often describing her as the kind of person who remembered your order and your story. But that day, Clara's story would take a turn that no one in Pima County would ever forget. It was a little after 4:30 p.m. when Clara waved goodbye to her coworker and walked toward her red Toyota Corolla parked at the edge of the gravel lot. A few witnesses recalled seeing her talk briefly with someone near the vehicle, a tall man in a pale blue shirt leaning against a dark pickup truck. The interaction seemed casual at first, but within moments, both were gone. The Corolla remained parked, the keys still in the ignition, and Clara Jennings was nowhere to be found. By nightfall, concern had spread quickly through the quiet neighborhood where Clara lived. Her roommate, a teacher named Angela Cross, realized something was wrong when Clara didn't return home. She tried calling her cell phone, no answer. Hours later, Angela drove past the cafe, only to find Clara's car abandoned under the same harsh streetlight. Inside, her purse was still on the passenger seat, her wallet untouched. It didn't look like she had left voluntarily. When officers from the Pima County Sheriff's Department arrived, they immediately sensed something wasn't right. The scene felt eerily frozen in time. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no broken glass, just silence and confusion. The detectives quickly began canvassing nearby gas stations, shops, and diners for anyone who might have seen her. But as the hours turned into days and the days into weeks, the trail grew colder. Clara's disappearance made local headlines, not only because of how sudden it was, but because of who she was. She was kind, dependable, and deeply rooted in the community. Her family, especially her father Robert Jennings, a retired firefighter, and her mother Evelyn, refused to give up hope. They spent weeks printing flyers, talking to reporters, and pleading with anyone who might know something. Robert's voice cracked during one televised interview when he said, "My daughter didn't just walk away. Someone out there knows what happened." Detectives followed every lead they could. A few tips came in about a dark truck seen leaving the area, possibly with out-of-state plates. Another caller claimed to have seen a man matching that same description near the desert road leading west of Tucson. When investigators combed through the area, they found nothing. No tracks, no discarded clothing, nothing to tie anyone to Clara's disappearance. The cafe staff was interviewed multiple times. Coworkers described Clara as being in good spirits that day, though one mentioned she'd been uneasy about a customer who had been showing up more frequently in recent weeks. "He wasn't rude," the coworker said, "but there was something about the way he looked at her, like he was waiting for her outside." The customer's description: a man in his mid-30s, tall, sandy-haired, with a local construction company logo on his jacket, was entered into the report, but there were no immediate matches. By late summer, the search had expanded statewide. Helicopters scanned the desert, cadaver dogs were deployed in dry washes, and volunteers joined the search teams, walking under the blistering sun with photos of Clara pinned to their shirts. But every effort ended the same way, with more questions and no answers. The Jennings family clung to each passing rumor, each unconfirmed sighting, each anonymous tip. Yet as months passed, the hope they carried began to fray. In December 2001, a small discovery near Saguaro National Park reignited the case. A hiker found a pair of women's sunglasses and a name-tagged cafe apron partially buried beneath desert brush. The tag read Clara. The items were carefully collected and sent for analysis. Soil samples suggested they had been there for several months. Nearby tire impressions were cast, but by then, the heat and wind had worn them down, making identification impossible. Investigators began re-interviewing those closest to Clara, this time looking for inconsistencies. One coworker mentioned something new, that Clara had recently received anonymous notes left on her car windshield. They weren't threatening, just odd short messages like, "You looked beautiful today and wish we could talk more." The handwriting was blocky and uneven, written with a felt-tip pen. The notes were never reported to police at the time, but that detail took the investigation in a new direction. Forensic examiners searched for fingerprints on the recovered items and rechecked Clara's car. One partial print lifted from the exterior driver's side door handle didn't match anyone in the database. In 2001, the technology for DNA comparison was still developing, and the sample was too small to test conclusively. Still, it was preserved, labeled, and stored, a tiny fragment of a puzzle that would take years to solve. By 2002, with leads exhausted and no body recovered, the case officially went cold. The Jennings family marked every anniversary with a candlelight vigil, hoping that one day the truth would surface. Her disappearance remained one of Tucson's most haunting mysteries, one that left detectives frustrated and a community uneasy. Years turned into decades. The evidence boxes, labeled Jennings, Clara, 2001, sat on a shelf in the cold case unit, gathering dust but never forgotten. In 2015, the department launched a statewide effort to re-examine unsolved cases using improved DNA technology. Clara's case was among the first selected for review. Detectives carefully unsealed the evidence, still preserved after all these years, and sent the small DNA sample from the door handle for retesting using new techniques capable of extracting usable genetic material from degraded traces. Months passed with no word. Then, in early 2016, the results came back with a partial profile. It wasn't enough for a match, but it was enough to reopen the conversation. A cold case investigator named Detective Sarah Hallbrook, known for her patience and attention to detail, took over the file. She studied every report, every interview, every photograph, and every note. One detail stood out to her. The man described by multiple witnesses near the cafe, the one with the construction logo. She began digging into local employment records from 2001. Her search led to a name, Daniel Price. At the time of Clara's disappearance, he'd been 34 and working as a contractor in Tucson. He had moved out of state in late 2002, eventually settling in Nevada. His name had surfaced in an early interview, but with no solid evidence tying him to the case, it had gone nowhere. Now, Detective Hallbrook decided to take another look. She reached out to Nevada authorities, who confirmed that Daniel Price was still living there, working as a mechanic in a small town north of Las Vegas. He had no serious criminal record, just minor traffic violations. But when detectives pulled his old employment forms, they noticed something odd. The handwriting on those documents looked eerily similar to the blocky, uneven letters from the anonymous notes Clara had once received. Detective Hallbrook had the samples compared by a handwriting expert, who concluded that the similarities were significant. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to warrant further investigation. The department decided to quietly monitor Price while preparing to collect a new DNA sample. When he tossed a coffee cup into a public trash can outside a gas station, investigators retrieved it, carefully sealing it for testing. Weeks later, the results came back, a match to the partial DNA recovered from Clara's car door. When detectives arrived at Daniel Price's modest home in March 2017, he appeared calm, surprised but not defensive. He denied knowing Clara Jennings at first, insisting he had maybe seen her once or twice at the cafe. But when confronted with the DNA evidence, his composure faltered. Detectives noted the tremor in his voice, the subtle shift in his posture. They asked him again how his DNA could have been found on her vehicle, a car he had claimed never to have touched. Price stared at the table for several long seconds before quietly saying, "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." That statement marked the beginning of a confession that would unravel one of Arizona's longest unsolved cases. He began to talk, slowly at first, then with growing resignation. He said he had met Clara several times at the cafe, sometimes coming in just to see her smile. He admitted that he had developed an obsession, convincing himself that she was interested in him. When she didn't return his attention, frustration grew into fixation. On that afternoon in July 2001, he followed her outside after her shift, intending to talk, but things spiraled quickly out of control. He described grabbing her arm, pleading for her to listen, and panicking when she resisted. In his words, "I didn't mean for it to go that far." The silence that followed those words in the interview room was heavy and unbroken. He then led investigators to a desolate area near the western desert outskirts of Tucson, just miles from where her apron had been found years earlier. There, buried beneath compacted earth and scrub brush, investigators uncovered what remained of Clara Jennings. Forensic teams worked carefully through the night, documenting every inch of the scene. It was clear that her death had occurred shortly after her disappearance. The decades of unanswered questions had finally reached a devastating conclusion, but the confession was only the beginning of what would unfold next. By the time the confession was fully recorded, the weight of decades pressing on Clara Jennings' family and the Tucson community was nearly tangible. Robert and Evelyn Jennings had been waiting 16 long years for closure, and the news that Daniel Price had admitted involvement, along with the discovery of Clara's remains, sent a mixture of relief and heartbreak through them. The parents, though devastated, were finally able to see the first real step toward justice. Detectives had been meticulous in reconstructing the events of that July afternoon. Price's story was horrifying yet methodical. He admitted to following Clara after her shift and attempting to coerce her into speaking with him privately. When she resisted, he lost control. The confrontation escalated, and in a moment of panic and rage, he struck her, resulting in her death. What followed was a calculated attempt to hide the evidence. Price transported Clara's body to the desert outskirts, a remote area he had explored often while working as a contractor, believing it would never be discovered. The confession provided investigators with crucial details they had never known. For example, he described how he had disposed of items from Clara's car, including the purse and personal effects, scattering them in separate locations to delay discovery. Some of these items had been recovered earlier, such as her apron and sunglasses, but now they could be linked directly to his actions. Investigators mapped out every location he mentioned, recollecting evidence that had been overlooked or misclassified in the original investigation. One of the most important breakthroughs came from DNA analysis. The cigarette cup Price had discarded provided a perfect sample for comparison. Modern forensic technology was able to amplify the degraded DNA from the 2001 car handle and compare it to the fresh sample from the cup. The match was conclusive. With this physical evidence paired with Price's confession, prosecutors had more than enough to file formal charges for first-degree murder and evidence tampering. The legal preparations began immediately. Price's attorney attempted to negotiate a plea deal, citing the years that had passed and his cooperation, but the severity of the crime and the prolonged suffering of Clara's family made prosecutors firm. They sought the maximum sentence available under Arizona law. The court case quickly became one of the most publicized cold case prosecutions in the state, drawing attention from national news outlets interested in the way forensic advancements had finally solved a case thought unsolvable. As the trial date approached, the Jennings family prepared themselves to relive the trauma in court. Robert often spoke to reporters about the importance of truth and the role of modern science in bringing criminals to justice. He said, "We wanted answers more than revenge. Clara deserves to be remembered, and we want the world to know the truth." Evelyn, quieter but equally determined, focused on supporting her husband and their daughter's memory, creating a small memorial garden in their backyard where they could reflect on her life. Witnesses were called to testify about the days surrounding Clara's disappearance. Coworkers shared memories of her kindness and the unease she felt with certain customers, providing context to the prosecution's narrative. Handwriting experts explained the comparison between the anonymous notes and Price's writing, and forensic scientists presented the DNA evidence linking him to the car and ultimately to the crime scene. During cross-examination, Price tried to minimize his responsibility, suggesting that his intentions had never been violent. The courtroom remained silent as he spoke, a stark contrast to the emotional testimony delivered by Clara's closest friends and family. The judge ensured that every aspect of the case was heard clearly, allowing jurors to grasp the full scope of the premeditation, the concealment, and the decades of unanswered questions that had followed Clara's disappearance. Outside the courtroom, public interest surged. The story of a cold case solved through a combination of confession and cutting-edge forensic techniques inspired community discussions on crime prevention, victim support, and the evolution of investigative methods. Local police departments highlighted the case as an example of the importance of preserving evidence and revisiting unsolved cases, no matter how old. The jury deliberated for only 3 days. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. The sentence handed down was life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Price showed no visible reaction as the judge read the decision, while the Jennings family felt a mixture of sorrow, relief, and the bittersweet closure they had long awaited. In the weeks following the verdict, attention turned to the community impact. The cafe where Clara worked held a small memorial for her regular customers and staff, remembering her warmth and dedication. Local media covered her life story in depth, emphasizing her contributions, her relationships, and the shock her disappearance had caused in Tucson. In schools and community centers, discussions arose about how to support young women in the face of obsession, harassment, and predatory behavior. For the Jennings family, life slowly resumed with the knowledge that justice had finally been served. They continued visiting Clara's memorial garden, sharing stories of her laughter, her ambitions, and the small daily moments that had defined her life. Robert continued advocating for cold case investigations statewide, using Clara's case as a compelling example of why persistence and patience matter in law enforcement. Meanwhile, the sheriff's department used the closure of this case to train new detectives in both traditional investigative techniques and the latest in DNA and forensic science. They emphasized that even the smallest piece of evidence, when preserved correctly, could become the key to solving a decades-old mystery. Officers were reminded that no disappearance should ever be considered hopeless, and every cold case carried the potential for resolution. Even years later, Clara Jennings' story continued to resonate. True crime authors, podcasts, and local historians revisited the case to highlight how modern technology and old-fashioned detective work intersected to bring a community long-held grief to an end. Her life, though tragically cut short, became a symbol of perseverance, reminding both law enforcement and families that justice, however delayed, could still arrive. The confession and subsequent arrest of Daniel Price not only solved a long-standing mystery, but restored faith in the investigative process for the Jennings family and the Tucson community. It also served as a lasting reminder that no matter how much time passes, truth has a way of emerging, and accountability can reach across decades to honor those whose voices were silenced. By confronting the past, embracing technological advancements, and pursuing every lead with diligence, the Tucson authorities closed a chapter that had haunted them for 16 years. Clara Jennings' story, once defined by uncertainty and fear, was now framed by resolution, remembrance, and the unwavering dedication of those who refused to let her case be forgotten. The months following Daniel Price's conviction were a mixture of solemn reflection and quiet healing for the Jennings family and the Tucson community. Though justice had finally been served, the emotional scars of 16 years of unanswered questions could not simply vanish overnight. Robert and Evelyn Jennings continued visiting Clara's memorial garden, tending to the desert wildflowers that had been planted in her memory. Each bloom seemed to symbolize both the fragility and resilience of life, an enduring testament to the daughter they had lost far too soon. In the local schools, Clara's story became part of a broader dialogue about safety, vigilance, and the importance of community awareness. Counselors, teachers, and parents held forums to discuss harassment, predatory behavior, and the ways children and teenagers could protect themselves. Clara's peers, now young adults, often participated, sharing first-hand experiences and emphasizing the critical lessons learned from the tragedy. For them, remembering Clara meant advocating for prevention and awareness, transforming grief into purposeful action. The Sheriff's Department, empowered by the success of this long-unsolved case, created a permanent cold case task force. Detectives trained in both classic investigative techniques and the latest forensic technology worked side by side to reopen files that had long been dormant. The Jennings case, often cited as a model of persistence and collaboration between law enforcement and the community, inspired similar initiatives in neighboring counties. Officers repeatedly emphasized that the combination of careful evidence preservation, modern DNA analysis, and the patience to follow every lead, no matter how old, was what ultimately solved the case. For Robert and Evelyn, life moved forward slowly. The raw ache of loss remained, but closure allowed them to grieve without the gnawing uncertainty that had defined the previous 16 years. They spoke openly to journalists about the complicated emotions surrounding justice delayed. Robert said, "We can't get Clara back, but we can honor her memory by ensuring no other family has to wait this long for answers." Evelyn added, "Closure isn't happiness. It's a quiet understanding that truth finally came to light." The community of Tucson also began to reckon with the betrayal of trust inherent in the crime. Neighbors who had unknowingly crossed paths with Price over the years struggled with the realization that someone they had seen daily had been hiding such darkness. Workshops on community safety and awareness were implemented at local community centers and youth organizations, blending education with remembrance. For many, Clara's story became a catalyst to engage with local law enforcement, fostering stronger relationships between citizens and the police. Clara's memorial garden quickly became a place of both remembrance and inspiration. Her old co-workers, friends, and teachers contributed to a small scholarship in her name for students pursuing careers in education, public service, and community activism. Each year, scholarships were awarded at a ceremony held in the garden, where recipients read essays about Clara's impact, sharing how her life, though tragically cut short, continued to inspire. Photos, letters, and small mementos were displayed along the garden path, allowing visitors to see the girl whose story had spanned 16 years of mystery and investigation. Meanwhile, the legal system used the case as a reference for prosecuting other long-unsolved crimes. Daniel Price's conviction, built on the combination of modern DNA techniques and his own confession, highlighted how advancements in forensic science could bring accountability long after a crime had been committed. Prosecutors in other jurisdictions cited the case when petitioning for grants to fund cold case units, DNA testing, and investigative genealogy research. Media coverage continued for years, often returning to the story as a symbol of the persistence of truth. Podcasts, documentaries, and true crime series revisited the case, emphasizing both the human tragedy and the triumph of science and determination. Interviews with Robert and Evelyn Jennings, law enforcement officers, and forensic specialists highlighted the painstaking work behind every breakthrough, painting a complete picture of how a seemingly unsolvable mystery could finally be unraveled. Psychologists and victim advocates pointed to Clara's case as an example of the long-term impact of unresolved trauma on families. The Jennings family participated in panels discussing grief, memory, and coping strategies for families of missing persons, emphasizing that closure could come decades later, but required support, patience, and an unwavering belief in justice. Their advocacy helped shape programs that offered guidance and counseling to thousands of families nationwide. As years passed, the desert garden became a hub for reflection and community gatherings. Anniversaries of Clara's disappearance were observed not with sorrow alone but with collective remembrance, educational workshops, and the celebration of the young woman she had been. Friends who had grown up with her shared stories of her laughter, creativity, and kindness, ensuring that her life was remembered as more than a tragedy, but as a force for ongoing good. Law enforcement continued to use the case to train detectives, forensic scientists, and students in criminal justice programs. The meticulous preservation of evidence, the patience to re-examine cold files, and the integration of DNA analysis with genealogical research were emphasized as critical lessons. Clara's case demonstrated that even the smallest piece of evidence, a cigarette butt, a discarded cup, a fragment of hair, could hold the key to unlocking decades-old mysteries. For the Jennings family, the long-awaited answers allowed them to honor Clara's memory fully. Each memorial, scholarship award, and community gathering reinforced the notion that while a life had been lost, her story had not ended in vain. Robert often remarked that every resolved case added a voice to those who could no longer speak, ensuring that victims' experiences could inspire change and vigilance. In the larger context, the case illustrated a shift in how society approached cold cases. It reinforced the message that no matter how much time passed, science, persistence, and human determination could uncover hidden truths. Families who had waited for years now saw tangible evidence that justice could reach across decades, offering hope that other unresolved disappearances might eventually be solved. Clara Jennings' legacy became multifaceted, a symbol of resilience, a case study in forensic innovation, and a source of inspiration for families and communities confronting unsolved crimes. Her memory prompted legal reforms, influenced educational programs, and created lasting community initiatives aimed at awareness, prevention, and support. Even as Daniel Price served his life sentence, the focus remained on remembering Clara rather than dwelling solely on the perpetrator. The Tucson community worked to preserve her story through gardens, scholarships, and educational programs, ensuring that each new generation would learn of the young woman whose life was tragically cut short, but whose influence continued to resonate. Clara's story reminded everyone involved that while evil can go unnoticed, it cannot remain hidden forever. Patience, diligence, and technological progress converge to give voice to the silenced, provide answers to the bereaved, and transform a community's grief into lasting action. Through remembrance, advocacy, and education, the Jennings family ensured that Clara's life, her dreams, her laughter, and her unfulfilled potential remained at the forefront of collective memory. Her legacy stands as a beacon of hope for families waiting for answers, investigators seeking justice, and communities striving to protect their most vulnerable. The tragedy of her disappearance became a catalyst for change, teaching that no case is ever truly cold when people refuse to forget, refuse to give up, and refuse to let silence define the story. Clara Jennings' memory continues to inspire Tucson to this day, demonstrating that justice, even after many years, is not only possible, it can also ignite hope, remembrance, and enduring positive impact for an entire community.